Welcome to the Compact Podcast. Today we'll discuss Bernie Sanders and AOC's tour across the country fighting oligarchy, the bankruptcy of 23andMe, and leaked group chats. I'm joined by Ashley Frawley and Geoff Shullenberger, and I'm Matthew Schmitz. So Bernie Sanders and AOC have been a very successful political duo in recent days. They've had a variety of stops: Arizona, Wisconsin, Colorado, often in red-tinged areas, drawing tens of thousands in crowds. And their message, the title of their tour, is Fighting Oligarchy. So this has inspired some enthusiasm within the Democratic base, especially as the leader of the Democratic Senate minority, Chuck Schumer, has reached an agreement with Republicans on a continuing resolution to keep the government funded, and is perceived as taking too weak a stance. So Bernie and AOC look like a bright spot for the party. What do you guys make of their barn burning tour?
Well, I mean, it's kind of a smart thing to do, I guess, because you want to capitalize on the millennial left, what's left of the millennial left, and that popularity that was once there. And a lot of people kind of looking at what's happened with Trump and fearing oligarchy. I mean, it's a valiant effort, I guess. But, looking at some of the messaging, you do wonder, have any lessons actually been learned? So, I think it was Sanders says, well, when I talked about oligarchy over the years, I think for some people it was an abstraction. Now, though, people understand you have to be blind not to see what we have today as a government of the billionaires, by the billionaires, and for the billionaires. Okay, fine, right? But then they say, well, let's what should we do in response? What should we do in response? Well, we need to capitalize on this moment by championing policies that address things like income inequality, healthcare, and climate change. If they do that, I think working people will come back into the fold, he predicted. Well, look, even just the framing of this, it's still in that kind of professional language, right? So this is the choice that American voters essentially had. You could choose between billionaires who'd made an alliance with the professional class, which saw the working classes as problems to be solved, to be administered to, which was a wink wink, don't worry, there'll be jobs for you in the administration of the working class. You'll be part of the social problems class. All of this language that basically treated the working class as kind of objects of pity and of charity. So that was your choice: pity, charity, professionals. We'll take care of you, versus billionaires another group of billionaires, still billionaires, who'd made an alliance with the working class. However, opportunistic and for show it might have been, that was the idea, who talked to the working class not as objects of charity or pity, but as they would like themselves to be seen: a powerful class with the future at its fingertips. Now, professionals love to go, ha, 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 all Americans are like temporarily embarrassed millionaires. Huh? Well, yes, they are. Yes, they are, because they recognize that there's a huge world of wealth and culture that is being kept from them. They should feel like temporarily embarrassed millionaires or billionaires. And so looking down on these people and basically saying, you should be kind of happy with the way things are. The best that we can kind of have here is some handouts and some government spending and a big fat administrative class that will be taken care of and that will take care of you. I mean, that's nobody's aspiration. That's nobody's desire and drive. So I just worry, like, nothing has really been learned here. It's still, the messaging is still in that professional language. It's kind of like, wink, wink, healthcare, climate change. These are the kinds of issues that will provide jobs for professionals. Basically, things will go back to the status quo. Not not really getting the message of what populism was bringing to the fore, what populism was a reaction against.
It seems clear that part of what is giving this a certain impetus is the presence of Elon Musk in the White House. Being a sort of giant, loud, and extremely sort of performative and self displaying target, kind of moving target for attacks on oligarchy. So there's something kind of strange about that. I mean, something I've been thinking about ever since last year was like, something that's significant here is that it's really unusual for a donor, for a party and a candidate's major donor to want to put themselves on display to this degree. Like, this is a very strange phenomenon, and that there are sound and clear reasons why historically neither politicians nor their donors have seen this kind of an arrangement as a desirable one. And the simplest reason for this is that the donor does not want to be if things go south for the politician, the donor doesn't want to be saddled with that and wants to be able to shift their donations in another sounder direction in the future and not be kind of permanently and indelibly associated with the fate of a particular political figure. And in turn, the politician usually doesn't want to be seen as essentially the puppet of an oligarch. So part of what's strange about this situation is that precisely this kind of relationship that is usually, at least to some extent, kept in the shadows, even if you can see them there might be plenty of press coverage of a politician glad handing with donors. It's like, think about this scene where I believe it was after his presidency where there was like Obama hanging out with Richard Branson on a private island. Okay, I mean, I'm not sure if Branson was ever a donor to his campaigns, but it was believed, okay, there's just something kind of unseemly and embarrassing about this relationship, right? And it seems to show up Obama as a fake. And as just like a sort of puppet of oligarchs. And so, part of what's weird about the current situation is that, okay, on one hand, this has given a kind of impetus to this reemergent kind of, reminiscent of 10 or so years ago, anti-oligarchy, sort of left populist messaging. But it's almost as if that, the sort of unmasking gestures that would seem to demand are already being preempted by the nature of the regime currently in the White House. That it just kind of brazenly puts on display the thing that historically what that kind of politics does is say, aha, well, behind every Obama there's a Richard Branson, or there's a Bill Gates, or whoever who's secretly pulling the strings. Well, in this case, it's all completely public and out in the open. And so, I think perhaps the limitations of the kind of revival of this sort of politics might have to do with the fact that we've reached this strange moment where the thing that was supposed to be kind of the dirty secret of like what goes on in the back room is actually the thing that is being shown to us every day. And I don't think that there's necessarily a conscious strategy with this, but there is a kind of preempting whereby the critique of oligarchy is seemingly strengthened, but I think maybe more subtle, by the obvious presence of a extremely wealthy donor kind of directly having a say directly in policy in ways that may actually be illegal given his lack of Senate confirmation. But that at the same time, this is this is like so it seems to create an obvious target for this sort of politics. but it's so sort of blatant and out in the open that it almost kind of preempts the thing that, again, this kind of politics usually does, which is sort of to unmask the secret, circulation of money behind politics. And so I don't know. I mean, I haven't quite figured this point out yet, but it's something I've been thinking about. And obviously it's kind of tied to, and going back to Ashley's point about this kind of rhetoric about temporarily embarrassed millionaires. I mean, another kind of tedious point of rhetoric has, from the left has been this, how can Trump be a populist if he's a, billionaire? But I mean, this has always been the secret. I mean, or it's not even a secret. This has just always been part of how he operates. He's not, the reason it was kind of, showing Obama or, Obama hanging out on Branson's private island or John Kerry windsurfing or whatever was supposed to be embarrassing to them was that they presented themselves publicly as, just kind of earnest public servants, but in fact they were living this kind of swanky oligarchic lifestyle behind the scenes. If you have a figure who's not pretending to be something other than what he is, then there is a kind of claim to authenticity that can be made there. And so again, I think that's sort of part of what's going on here. And so the question is, is this politics ultimately limited by the fact that it can't expose, like it's not exposing anything. It's just pointing to something that is already putting itself out in the open and saying, so what are you going to do about it? And, I think that means we're kind of at an interesting point. And the kind of ultimate vacuousness of that sort of temporarily embarrassed millionaires rhetoric and the sort of, how can you be a populist rhetoric, like, none of that ever worked, and it was all extremely obtuse. And so I think similarly there's a limit to the revival of this left populism oligarchy against messaging against oligarchy in this moment, precisely because this is like a performance of oligarchy. This is an open performance of oligarchy, and so you can't expose or unmask it. It's already there. It's already out in the open. So then the question is, how do you oppose that when it's already kind of telling you and signaling to you directly what it is?
And also, it's much preferable to the performance of kindness, that performative kindness, which looked down on people. And while, pretended to care while collecting paychecks, by the way, that were ultimately funded out of the taxes of the working class. So totally parasitic. This is like, I'm talking about like the NGO class and this kind of thing. This is sort of unproductive. Whereas at least the sort of billionaires, while also being funded indirectly by the labor of the working class, depending on what economic theory you're going with, at least there's some new value being created there. Everyone else was just being a parasitic sucker the whole time, sort of pretending to have your best interest at heart. So in a way, there is a kind of logic of people being like, well, I'll take the guy who's, there's that famous cartoon where it's like, there's a billboard and there's a wolf that's like, I will eat you. And then the lambs or the sheep are like, see, he tells it like it is. Well, yeah, I kind of want that. I know what I'm dealing with, Otherwise, before you needed like a PhD and 10 layers of discourse analysis to see these people were actually insulting you.
The term oligarchy is interesting because it's not a very long-standing term in American discourse. Something like plutocracy would have been more common in a previous age, and I think its popularity now on kind of left populist circles has to do with its association with Russia, as Trump calls it, and the idea that a kind of implicit comparison between the Trump regime and a corrupt Russia, where a strongman leader has these aligned businessmen who receive the favor of the state and lend the state their support in turn. And Musk is an oligarch in the sense that his entire wealth is built on state support. There is no wealthy Elon Musk without the American taxpayers investing in his company over and over again, promising that they're going to buy his products, offering all kinds of credits for these electric vehicles. This is absolutely the intertwining of industry and the state. That's the story of Elon Musk. We can present him as this brilliant entrepreneur who, uh, you know, is interested in cutting regulation and just being free to engage in these wonderful kind of laissez-faire uh, processes. But really, it's a very different story. It's a story that is about deliberate state encouragement of industry. And it bears saying this is a version of industrial policy, of the intertwining of government and business that has been historically supported most strongly by the left, because Elon Musk is a product of green politics, basically industrial policy, state encouragement of certain forms of market behavior for the sake of advancing the green transition. So if he's an oligarch, he's the representation of a kind of oligarchy that has been consistently encouraged by the left, and that is now, in its full flowering, and its production of Elon Musk is applauded and embraced by the right. So the only people in American political discourse who are really opposed to this form of oligarchy, I think, are probably kind of these consistent libertarian writers. But that's not, sure, they're on the right, but that's not really representing the broad where the right is broadly. It's very pro Elon. Yes, Tesla is good, and there is increasing openness among Republican policymakers to various kinds of industrial policy, which to succeed will require the same kinds of state intervention and subsidy that helped build Tesla and SpaceX. So, if America is going to be advancing industrial policy, if it wants to compete with China in terms of building up our own technologies and companies and all this, we're probably going to get more oligarchs, and there's actually in the mold of Elon Musk, and there actually seems to be a pretty firm bipartisan consensus in favor of this. It's interesting too, the Bernie AOC tour. They're denouncing the billionaires. Sanders himself has proposed an annual tax on the extremely wealthy, the top 0.1% of American households. So those who have a net worth of 32 million or more. And this is fascinating to me because I think it shows how things have changed since 2008, 2009, when you had Occupy Wall Street. Back then, the focus of ire was the 1%, and it was the 99% against the 1%. Well, the Democratic coalition has become more upscale since then. So I think it's not a surprise that Sanders's focus is now on the 0.1% rather than the 1%. Bernie Sanders has an estimated net worth of $3 million or more. Sanders is in the top 1% probably of Americans in terms of net worth. He didn't get there by taking bribes to push his legislative priorities. He sold books, right? He's made prudent investments. He's like a lot of kind of high professional Americans who have worked hard, have real talent, and made some good choices, and are enjoying the material rewards of that. But I think you see kind of adjustment even on the part of Sanders and AOC to the shifting nature of their coalition. And one thing that's good about focusing on those oligarchs is that you don't have to look so much at those high professionals who aren't oligarchs but are doing better than a lot of Americans. I want to, after those critical comments, I do want to say something in praise of AOC and Bernie. They seem to understand that politics is oppositional. You need to go out there and say, these are the bad guys. These are the ones who are causing you trouble, and we're going to fight them. And I really think it's that fighting spirit that a lot of observers and a fair number of just people who are attending these rallies, they're responding to that spirit, and forms a real contrast with some of the more wonkish responses to Democratic failure. You have the abundance guys, Ezra Klein and Derek Thompson, who we discussed previously on the Compact podcast. They've offered proposals for kind of sunny vision of an expanding pie through deregulation, through more housing that will allow all of America to get richer without either this kind of class rhetoric or without various kinds of more intensive government intervention or redistribution that they're maybe wary of. Well, I think AOC and Bernie are just have a keener sense of how politics works, so that you do need an oppositional element, and not everything is a win-win. Sometimes, even in a capitalist society where you can increase opportunity and you can have that rising tide at times. Often, for someone to do better, someone else has to do worse, and especially status is a limited quantity and has to be redistributed. So I think that's what AOC and Bernie get, and probably the abundance dudes should take a couple notes from them. Sometimes that rising tide ebbs. 23andMe, the genetic testing company, which once had a valuation of $6 billion, has declared bankruptcy. Its former CEO, a woman who's resigned, is now trying to buy the company. People are going on 23andMe and deleting their genetic data just stored on the site because they don't know who it will be sold to. And I think this is just an interesting moment for a couple of reasons. One, there's been this whole kind of tech economy, and much of it really thrives on data collection, getting information about you that can then be sold. And there's nothing more extensive and invasive in a way than this DNA. These genetic testing companies have been used to solve crimes at times, right? You can collect a DNA sample and you may not have a match for it in your database, but you can feed it into 23andMe and find, oh, well, it's related to these 10 people. That narrows it down pretty well. But I think more broadly, the success of 23andMe and now its current fall raises questions for me about this political moment we're in that I see really starting in probably 1995 with the publication of Barack Obama's memoir Dreams from My Father. And here I really want to focus on the subtitle of that memoir, A Story of Race and Inheritance. And I think Obama really gave eloquent voice to the desire a lot of people have to kind of understand their roots, where they're from. So especially in our society where people are more atomized, a lot of religious and communal institutions have broken down, family ties are more frayed. People want to know where they're from. They want to have a sense of that. And I think 23andMe was one of the many responses to that desire that many people feel. And so for me, it's a company that has a significance in cultural terms that goes well beyond its now minuscule valuation.
So I was going to note here that one of the biggest sort of popularizers of genetics as a sort of cultural phenomenon, interestingly, was Henry Louis Gates Jr., who was the premier scholar of African American literature and culture, kind of his generation, and really the figure who kind of comes out of the foundation of African American studies programs and departments that begins in the late 60s and extends through the 70s, and really produces a body of work that's considered it is taken very seriously in scholarly terms. You could argue he's a kind of figure of respectability for this field. Ends up at Harvard, and he's a very erudite and interesting figure. Pretty, I'd say, compared to some of the kind of foundational figures in this field who were often tied to kind of Black nationalist politics. He's a pretty moderate sort of figure politically. But in any case, one thing that's interesting is later in his career, he's long tenured at Harvard, has published a number of very very serious and important books, and he starts a TV program that's about genetics, where basically people come on and discuss with him the results of their 23andMe or whatever other genetic tests they've taken. And it's interesting because it ties back to this famous series Roots, right, which is about people, which is about, it comes from the book by Alex Haley. It kind of dramatizes Black Americans kind of attempting to trace their roots back to Africa. And that's also a huge phenomenon in its time at a somewhat earlier moment. And so there is an interesting, I thought of this because, Matthew, you brought up Obama, because there is an interesting way this ties very much to American racial politics and to the desire to trace these ancestries, and to find some kind of connection to the old country, wherever that may be. And so, yeah, it does seem to, I think, also speak to the culture of globalization, of greater mobility, of people, attempting to look back to, where their roots were, and also a time when people are becoming more, there's more interracial marriage, there's more intermarriage between different religious and ethnic groups, and so there's a sense of kind of dilution. And that then produces this interest in kind of tracing lineage as a popular phenomenon. And then this is kind of weird, but I'll say one other thing that I think speaks to the appeal of this, which is interesting because it's on one hand it's cutting edge science, which is marketed as a sort of popular tool. So it's an interesting kind of commercial application of what was, and if you grew up kind of in the last decade of the 20th century, as I did, genomics was really like, there was kind of this promise of unlocking the human genome was just going to tell us everything we needed to know about basically everything. And then this didn't really happen, right? It was really like, it was presented as if this was going to be kind of the theory of everything. We would understand everything about humanity once this was done. And then for various reasons, that didn't really come about. So instead, what happened was this kind of commercialization of genetics and genomics, that it became a commercial product, as opposed to a kind of science, a kind of science of everything that was originally promised. And it became a form of kind of personal self-discovery. So this is quite interesting. But then the other thing that I've written about in relation to this is, weirdly enough, the popularity of the novel The Da Vinci Code, which, if people recall, involves centrally this idea of a bloodline that can be traced back to Jesus and Mary Magdalene. And what's interesting to me is that this novel, I think, appears in 2002, 2003, and is incredibly popular. People have kind of forgotten about it now, but I think there's a deeper logic here by which the sort of incredible popular traction of this novel, which really is engaged in this very reactionary political fantasy, which is directly tied to ideas about monarchy, right? It's the idea that there's a kind of French, a French monarchic line that's connected to the that originates in the offspring, the secret offspring of Jesus and Mary Magdalene. So it's this extremely reactionary fantasy, which is actually tied to French neo-monarchism, post-revolutionary neo-monarchism, and the attempt to kind of create a new story of origins that will somehow revitalize the fortunes of the French royalists. And so what's really strange about this is that it gains incredible traction, and people are very excited about this. This very bizarre and again kind of extremely backward looking sort of political fantasy. But I think it's notable that this really appears and circulates and becomes popular around the same time that the commercialization of these genetic tests becomes popular, and that people become obsessed with tracing their lineages and their sort of bloodlines back to their origins, supposedly. And so that there's something, there's something that happens like in the early part of the millennium, whereby people become fascinated with these sorts of narratives. And I mean, I would read it as this kind of ultimately quite reactionary political turn, but I'm sort of curious what Ashley has to add to that.
Yeah, I mean, there's a part of me that sees it as completely understandable, this desire for a sense of, I don't know, belonging, this kind of romantic desire to reject, understandable, but I think regressive. But there's this sort of romantic desire to reject the kind of mass society and its tendency to homogenize culture, and to therefore search for something special and unique, and this kind of thing. So I always had this kind of like eyebrow raised when it came to the popularity of things like 23andMe and Ancestry DNA and all of that. But it's quite funny because I heard about this story first from my dad, who sent it to me in a message. He was like, quick, delete your DNA information. It's like, why would I have ever sent my DNA? First of all, sorry to out my family, but lots of us are criminals. I don't want to like give any information that could get any of my family members locked up. Second of all, we're native. So there's like, we all by necessity know who our ancestors were, back to like a woman named Jawbone who came down from Quebec in a canoe like 400 years ago. Like anybody who ever tells you, oh, I am native, but I don't know my ancestors, if someone carried off an Indian at some point, they're lying, because you literally just have to know all of your ancestors. You've got all the papers. The data keeping on Native people is absolutely extraordinary. So there's no need to send my DNA off to anybody. And I was thinking, it's like, Dad, you didn't do this, did you? Like, better, surely. But anyways, so yeah, it's just another one of these things where what could be something that's just interesting, or, allows people to have a kind of connection to the story of their family or whatever, which, although I have a kind of, I think there are some, deeply regressive tendencies within it, are nonetheless harmless in and of themselves, turn around and can be used against us, like so many things in our society. Obviously, I mentioned a moment ago, using this information, police using this information. It was quite funny because a lot of people who follow sort of true crime were, the selling of all of this data, or the use of this data. I'm not sure it was sold, actually. The use of this data by police was a boon to true crime, because a ton of these unsolved sort of murders were found. But I remember my sister and I kind of looked at each other and we were like, that's exactly why I'm not going to be giving any of my DNA over. I don't want anyone to be found out. But also, just so bad, you can tell I'm like from the riffraff. But also the data breach in 2023, which was part of the, I think, 23andMe's downfall, exposed another really striking way that this stuff can be used against us. Because like the idea that you would find the answers to all life's questions in DNA fine. When it comes to your family, it's just a bit of fun. But when it comes to like the role that this all plays in government, is incredibly, incredibly regressive. And it is part of that long-standing tendency to search for the answers to insoluble problems inside the heads and the blood and the minds of individuals, as opposed to the structures of society. And you could take this, I'm not saying governments did this, but that kind of underlying the backwardness of that underlying explanatory framework is really revealed in what happened with a lot of that data from 2023, in that it was used by conspiracy theorists to, I think it was up to half of the people who had been using 23andMe had their DNA had their data compromised and their genetic information available, and it was being used by anti-Semitic conspiracy theorists online who were able to make connections between families and this sort of thing to fuel these sort of anti-Semitic conspiracy theories of these Jewish families that controlled everything and so on. And also, not even just like, drawing these connections like a crazy person in front of a board or whatever, but also 23andMe itself accidentally propagated anti-Semitic theories of ancestry, for instance, for Ashkenazi Jews, saying that they were the descendants of this Turkish tribe from, along like the sort of trade routes, and not therefore from Israel. So this whole idea that actually the Jews today were just converts and they have no claim to Israel, et cetera, et cetera. This was a really powerful idea that was originally actually supposed to absolve the Jews of responsibility for Christ's death, saying, they were nowhere nearby, but actually became this sort of reason to say that the Jews have no claim on Israel. They kind of propagated this themselves by saying, wow, a lot of these people might come from this like Y chromosome haplogroup something from a single Khazarian male who lived in this area and so on. And they actually put that information out there. And then these kinds of anti-Semitic people were like, see, look, the Ashkenazi Jews actually have nothing to do with Israel and so on. But anyway, so it's just another example of this use of your information against you, which I think is really, unfortunately, one of the only ways that this information gets used within our society as it is, to kind of blame you for something that goes wrong.
Your comments about your tribal identity and how you have to have all these papers and, whatever, Jawbone begat so-and-so, begat so-and-so, begat so-and-so, begat Ashley, basically, it is very striking and confirms my sense that the whole DNA data industry is a response to and a reflection of deracination, of uprooting of people, not really knowing kind of who they are or where they're from. I mean, you have kind of, strong reasons to know yourself, legal related to tribal membership and nationality, but also, a very particular history that informs those necessities. And, you can contrast it with another, kind of story, to return to American politics. It's maybe in a way a bookend to Obama's quest for his roots and Henry Louis Gates's promotion of genetics, kind of extending that Alex Haley idea. And that's Elizabeth Warren issuing the results of a DNA test she had done by a Stanford professor in 2018, and using this to claim that she had an American Indian ancestor between 6 and 10 generations ago, and then drawing a very sharp rebuke from the Cherokee Nation. She had claimed to be Cherokee, saying genetics has nothing to do with tribal membership. It has nothing to do with it. They're very insistent, and this is a very traditional idea that, obviously, tribal membership, it's just like membership in a family, is closely connected to descent and genetic connections, but it's above all, a legal identity. You can be adopted, right? And then you have just as much. You are just, in legal terms, just as much a member of the family as an actual son. And this, this is a kind of idea going back to, olden days, royal times. A Caesar could adopt a son, and then he would just be, his son. He would have all the rights. And if he had a bastard child by someone, that actual genetic connection would in no way, shape, or form trump the legal reality, which was much more significant. So it's Yeah, it's interesting to see genetics. It's kind of a search for roots, but in this very very modern way. I don't think the desire to find out this kind of information will recede. 23andMe's financial failure seems to have a, a lot to do with the fact that it's hard to build a business off something that you can only sell one time. Usually you rely on returning customers, but at some point, everyone who wants to get genetically tested has got genetically tested. Um, I would actually love to get my 23andMe results, but I'm just too mistrustful to spit in the tube.
Right? You
So
might be related to a criminal, and do
yeah,
you
so
really
the
want them to
idea
be?
it just appeals to me. I'm kind of denouncing and say this is bad, this is modern. I would like to know, it would be nice, but I just can't overcome this real reluctance I feel in terms of handing over my DNA to whatever the creditors of this company.
Yeah, they'll find it'll go to your insurance, right? Like this is the thing. Like we don't know where all this data is going to go now. They're like, "Oh, we might not sell it. We probably will, though. We need to protect our assets." What's your assets? Like it's the freaking DNA of people. I can well imagine this going to insurance companies. Who knows? They're some of the things that people are talking about are things like targeted advertising. What, like based on like, oh, based the clock's ticking here. You might get this disease soon. You'll need. I don't want that. That's less bad than like my insurance company being like, oh, you're high risk. I'm gonna knock your premiums up or something.
Absolutely. Jeff, have you got 23andMe? Do you know your roots?
No, but my sister did. So it was kind of a weird mix of things that were already known and things that were just kind of weird. And I mean, the other thing that's kind of fascinating about it is like it's probabilistic. So in other words, it's not. I think people. If you've looked into this, you'll know this, but people sort of misunderstand what it's not as if there are actual genes that, are identified with particular ethnicities. It's that there are like particular segments of the DNA that are, closely associated with certain groups and more likely to be, an indication that you're descended from certain groups rather than others. But it's all probabilistic, and I think that's kind of a fascinating thing about it as well, in terms of people wanting this a sense of rootedness from it, whereas what it actually offers is something quite a bit vaguer. And I mean, Ashley brought up native ancestry. My understanding is that I suppose in part because there are relatively few native people compared to, say, like people of Irish descent in North America. There just isn't that much data for them, and so that means that if you're descended from groups that are relatively small and ill represented in the database, then the results will not pick up on that, if that makes sense. So in other words, because it's probabilistic, it's all based on how heavily represented certain groups are within the trove of data. And so that means, there's a lot of the narrative that is left out because it's heavily reliant on, the what the largest groups are that have provided data already. And then groups that are, relatively small in the scheme of things, it's actually hard for them to really know anything about their, it's hard for you to know anything about your ancestry through this means, because it simply doesn't provide that information. So you'd be better looking at the, whatever tribal registers or, more traditional modes of documentation. So yeah, I think that's kind of an interesting aspect of it as well, that it is really this kind of, data, the epistemic framing of it is this probabilistic one. So it's in a way ill suited to this desire for certainty, right?
So we're all millennials here, I believe, and we're also, I think, fair to say, in middle age, all of us. Not so long ago, millennials were considered young, but we're all, I don't know. we're not in our 20s anymore. That's fair to say. Certainly. And millennials are taking power across the West slowly. The boomers are giving way a little bit. Millennials are coming to the fore. And the clearest indication of this yet is the fact that we have a leaked group chat with national security implications. Jeffrey Goldberg, the editor of The Atlantic, reported that he was added to a Signal group. It's a kind of app often used for more confidential communications. It's seen as having better security than other services. He was added to this group by Michael Waltz, national security official in the Trump administration, and Pete Hegseth, Secretary of Defense, was on there, J.D. Vance, Vice President, other figures, and they were discussing plans for the bombing of Yemen. Highly confidential, and not just not a very secure way of conducting business. I saw Chris Coons, the senator from Delaware, say all these people should be arrested. They've violated the law. They've committed crimes by failing to observe various presidential records acts. I'm less interested in the kind of criminal element of it because it basically has the same value as the kind of Hillary's emails stuff, kind of arrest Hillary. I mean, there are always these discussions, but I think it's kind of a sign of just generational turnover and the really the future of politics, because surely a lot of business is going to be conducted on group chats in the future.
It's funny that you started this by talking about being millennials, because I think that also one characteristic of being millennial is that you're kind of in denial about your age. Maybe that's just me, but I remember I started doing the math recently on. I'm like, gosh, these people look about my age, and I look at them. I'm like, shoot, they are my age, and like a half of, and like I'm not used to, I don't feel like this is right. I'm like, no, people in power, they're old, they're boomers, they're my parents. And I'm like, no, oh my God, or my grandparents. No, no, no. And I had this thought, like, a part of me was like, man, I've been so unsuccessful in my life. Look at these people running the world. And then this happened, and I thought that is something I would do. So, there's like, so it's like, it is such an incredibly millennial thing, that you would conduct so much of your business like on a phone. Yeah, why not? But the other thing that was, and it was so bad because apparently the generation under us, they don't use emojis as much. And it was embarrassing to see like important information of national security significance communicated with emojis, and it just felt so like,
yeah, younger people look on the kind of laugh crying emoji as the most cringeworthy expression of millennial identity. It's like, oh, that's so millennial to send that emoji.
Yeah, and it's like, we're in the millennial, you just dropped a bomb, cry emoji, like wow. And that's such a great example of the infantilization of our culture that our generation came to embody. And the other thing that was incredibly concerning was the degree to which this appeared to be just kind of on the fly. Like, hey, should we drop some bombs? Oh, I don't know. Shouldn't we think about the messaging a little more? Let's do it. Like, what? I always pictured people in a room somewhere, with a big giant map and little figures on it, and they're moving the figures around like there's some great mastermind behind it all. I don't know. Maybe I was wrong. Maybe this is some big plan and they were just like going to execute it that day. But to me, it just seemed like the incredible, should we, I don't know, yeah, let's go ahead kind of thing. Like, and then bombs start dropping, and there's a reporter.
So I think that there was reference to kind of prior and presumably in-person discussions, but yeah, it's very different from the kind of reassuring vision you get in Hollywood productions. I'm thinking of something like North by Northwest, where all these people are gathered in a room in DC around a long, shiny table, and they're wearing suits and saying, "Well, what should we do here?" Or even the just the classic war planning scenes you have for various heads of state, men in uniforms with many things on their chests, instead of the guys texting as they try to pick up their kids from school or whatever.
Yeah, and then when the order comes, you kind of picture them like marching with some papers. Like, here's what the weapons are going to be, but this guy's just like texting. Tick, 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 tick. Here's the weapons we're going to use. Tick, tick, tick. Like, what? Like, that's these are people with access to the nuclear codes, presumably. I found that to be really, really worrying. But and also how they did not notice that they had added, because it's actually quite a process to add somebody to a group. You see them being added. And I to be fair, like, I'm still a member of all kinds of WhatsApp groups that I just forgotten about, that I muted at some point, and then somebody kind of removes me from the group, and I'm like, whoops, sorry. That somebody like noticed 6 months later or something. Like, I could see that, but it was like they physically created the group and added the number, to the point where if I was more conspiratorially minded, which I already am to a certain degree, I would wonder, like, is this like a psyop? It's such an incredible, glaring, stupid mistake.
Yeah, so one theory is that Waltz, who created the chat in the first place, had been previously leaking to Goldberg. I mean, who is a, experienced foreign policy, national security reporter, who's had lots of ins with various administrations. So, then I suppose the question is, I mean, I think officially this would be understood as a leak, so it could mean that Waltz could be prosecuted on that basis. So I don't know. I mean, one level of the psyop would just be that Waltz had some motivation to do this, but I don't really know what that would be. As far as I can tell, like the two levels of it that are noteworthy are him being added in the first place. I mean, I suppose people not noticing or pointing that out. And then also, I saw somebody suggest that maybe people thought JG was Jameson Greer, the trade representative. And then, but I mean, the most notable would be not Waltz, but Pete Hegseth actually putting the plan, the actual plans for these
Right.
strikes in the chat, which kind of took it to another level. And was really where things went quite haywire, as far as having kind of broader national security implications if they're sharing this in a fundamentally insecure channel. But I don't know. It's just kind of a bizarre moment, I think. I mean, I brought up earlier this sort of this way that part of the way this administration operates, to what extent consciously or not, is through this kind of preempting of criticisms, whereby people want to call out oligarchy, but like there's just a kind of shameless performance of oligarchy 24/7, and so there isn't anything left to be kind of unmasked or exposed. And so one way to interpret this, even if it's more of a kind of Freudian slip than anything else, is this kind of performance for the public of the things that you might be criticized for, that you might be attacked for. So in other words, people are going to say, these guys are clowns, they're incompetents, they don't they don't know what they're doing, etc. And it's like they're kind of just putting that on display. I mean, we've seen this with the Doge cuts as well. That like, they created this website where they put up all these supposed cuts that they had made, many of which were revealed to have been either complete, misrepresentations, where they claimed something was, a budget line of like 800 billion, and then it turned out to be 800 million. Or other things where they claim to have cut a grant that was actually terminated in 2017 or something, and that already hadn't been disbursed for a decade. So there's again this kind of putting on display these things that are just sort of easy targets. And on one level, this seems extremely discrediting, because it just makes them look, bungling and inept. But on the other hand, it kind of it it short circuits the normal procedure of criticism, by which somebody has to expose or somebody, you need a sort of Seymour Hersh or a Woodward and Bernstein or whatever to kind of dig into the inner workings and show that this is all proceeding catastrophically. And instead they're just kind of putting all this on display. And it's like, I don't exactly know what it does for them, but what it does do is kind of put their critics in this odd position of like, not really being able to unmask or expose anything. I mean, I suppose you could argue Goldberg was, but even there, it's not like he had to kind of undertake some sort of cloak and dagger mission to do this. It was all just kind of put on display for him. It was just kind of given to him. And so there's this odd way that again kind of short circuits the normal functions of political, the way the political opposition and the way journalism is supposed to function, and just puts everybody in this weird situation where it's like it's all happening out in the open, and all you can do is kind of point to it, but it's already kind of pointing to itself. It's already showing itself to us as what it is. So I don't know. It's a very strange situation, and that's not necessarily a sort of psyop interpretation of it so much as just a sense that there's something going on here that makes it difficult for the various kind of oppositional forces to behave as they might like to.
I think there's a future for whoever discovers this ancient technology of the phone. Donald Trump has risen to power in part because he doesn't have an email address and he doesn't send text messages. So he has this kind of absolute boomer mentality of just picking up the phone and pressing flesh. Those are his two ways of getting things done. And I think maybe there will be some kind of return to the phone by some Zoomers or their successors. They'll rediscover this ancient technology. But with that, thank you, Ashley. Thanks, Geoff. Thanks to our producer, Stephen Adebato. Thank you, listeners. Go to compactmag.com/subscribe. There you can read all of our content, our huge viral article, The Vanishing of White Male Writers by Jacob Savage, a very detailed explanation of the transformations in our literary world and how they have worked to the detriment of a particular demographic. You can read Hamilton Craig on the democratic meaning of manifest destiny, a concept that's usually seen as outdated and reactionary, and he explains really its kind of progressive meaning and its connection to our country's political ideals.